Hello, hello. Thank you all for being here. We are so excited for today's program. I am Emma Goldblatt, and I am the program manager at Peace Advocacy Network. And for those of you who don't know, our mission is to promote a peaceful existence through veganism, social justice, and respect for the Earth's inhabitants and resources. PAN strives for the absence of violence in the lives of people and animals by eliminating oppression and inequity. To this end, PAN is committed to fostering, cultivating, and preserving a culture of diversity and inclusion among everyone we work with. Before I introduce all the speakers, I also want to introduce Barbara Gardner. Barbara, if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Emma. So hello, I'm Barbara Gardner, the founder of the Animal Interfaith Alliance. I'm delighted that the Animal Interfaith Alliance is jointly hosting this interfaith panel webinar with Peace Advocacy Network, and that two of our patrons and a director and the president of one of our member organisations, Catholic Concern for Animals, are on the panel. For those who don't know us, the Animal Interfaith Alliance is an alliance of the world's most influential faith-based animal advocacy organisations, which speaks out on the moral treatment of animals by drawing on the combined wisdom of all faiths and worldviews. It promotes social harmony as well by bringing the faith groups together on an issue they all share a concern for. Our activities include animal advocacy and education. We're a member of the United Nations Environment Programme. We're an accredited organisation to them and a member of their Faith for Earth coalition. We're also a member of the World Federation for Animals and Eurogroup for Animals. So finally, I'd like to thank Emma particularly for organising this special event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So glad you could be here and work together for this great cause. I want to introduce you to all of our amazing panelists we have today. We have 4 very accomplished, passionate animal advocates with us, and they have done so much, and I wish I could list it all for you today, but I also want to leave plenty of time for them to speak and answer questions, so I'll make sure to put the bios in the description wherever this video is posted, along with any relevant links where you can learn more about their work. But first, I wanted to introduce you to Bishop John Arnold, who was appointed Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford by Pope Francis in 2014 and currently serves as President of Catholic Concern for Animals. He holds a law degree from Trinity College, Oxford, and was called to the bar in 1976. After entering the Institute of Charity, Roseminians, he studied for the priesthood in Rome, where he earned both a license and doctorate in canon law. Ordained a priest in 1983 and a bishop in 2006, Bishop John served as an auxiliary bishop in Westminster Diocese. Inspired by Pope Francis, Bishop John has urged the Catholic community to take action against climate change, emphasizing the need to think globally and act locally. Next, I want to introduce you to Rabbi Shimi Yanklowitz. He has twice been named one of America's top rabbis by Newsweek and has been named by The Forward as one of the most 50 influential Jews and one of the most inspiring rabbis in America. Rabbi Yanklowitz is the author of 27 books on Jewish ethics, and his writings have appeared in diverse outlets, among many secular and religious publications. He served as speaker at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and a Rothschild Fellow in Cambridge, UK. Rav Shmuley received a master's from Harvard University as well as Yeshiva University and his doctorate from Columbia University. He was ordained as a rabbi by Yeshivat Bevei Torah, along with 2 private ordinations in Israel. He serves as the founder and president of Shemayim Jewish Animal Advocacy. His wife Shoshana and their 4 children live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and they're also foster parents. Next is Dr. Christina Nellist. She holds a PhD in Eastern Orthodox Theology with a focus on animal suffering and human soteriology. She is a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and serves as president and treasurer of Pan-Orthodox Concern for Animals. Dr. Nellist is a board member of both the Animal Interfaith Alliance UK and the Orthodox Fellowship of the Transfiguration USA. She authored Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Animal Suffering, the first of its kind, and has spoken at international conferences, including the Halki Summits. Her efforts include advocating for the integration of creation care into Orthodox education and recently consulted on the Orthodox film Face of God. Dr. Nellist also contributed to global animal protection efforts and has authored works on climate crisis and ecological integrity. Lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Will Tuttle, who is the visionary author of the international bestseller, The World Peace Diet, which has been published in 17 languages. A former Zen Buddhist monk and Dharma master in the Korean Zen tradition, he has been a dedicated vegan since 1980. Dr. Tuttle is the recipient of the Courage of Conscience Award and Empty Cages Prize. In addition to his influential writings, he is a gifted composer, having released 10 albums of original uplifting music. His work spans across themes of spirituality, intuition, and social justice, and he is a prominent speaker featured in numerous documentaries and online broadcasts. As a global advocate for compassion, he has delivered thousands of presentations in over 50 countries, inspiring others to embrace vegan living and compassionate ethics.
Hi.
So with that, welcome everyone. And we are going, if everyone else can please mute just so we can hear our speakers, that would be great. Thank you so much. And the first question I'm going to start with is, how does your faith inform your view of veganism? And we are going to start off with Bishop John.
Thank you. I've been looking at the scriptures that guide our faith, and I've seen nothing that says that veganism is in any way sort of recognized as such. But there again, there's nothing that speaks against it. Within the life and activity of Jesus himself, it would seem that he was a meat eater. He observed the Passover meal. There are miracles for the capture of fish and the cooking of fish that are recorded in the scriptures. So I think if he were to have been professing veganism himself, we would have heard some much more direct quotes in the scriptures about that. But that does not in any way inhibit an idea of veganism in the Catholic faith, because as I understand it, we are honoring creation in its fullness. And that means that we recognize that everything is connected. I think we're only just learning more and more about the sentient nature of animals. I think we've been very callous in our treatment of animals, particularly in the production of meat. And I think that will be a very good pillar for many people to see a stimulus in looking towards veganism as something to be welcomed. I don't think that my faith would ever see it as something compulsory, but I have certainly seen a much greater increase in interest in what veganism is all about, particularly as you connect it with climate change, care of the environment, and our care for creatures. We've been very, very callous, and I think we've got a lot to learn. But I'm all very, very pleased with the amount of learning that is going on, and surprised by the number of people who are showing a real interest in veganism. I'm not a vegan myself, but I've certainly moved in that direction within the last 10 years quite considerably. And I think there's a lot to be advocated in learning more about veganism and how we understand it.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Shmuley, if you'd like to go next.
Great. And I am starting a 2-minute timer because to express Judaism on veganism in 2 minutes, I'm going to hold myself accountable. First, in honor of the great Bishop John Arnold and in honor of my grandparents who were Catholic, I'm going to post in the chat a statement from Pope Francis 2 years ago on calling for meat reductionism, which I found very inspiring. This Pope's leadership on food justice issues and as it relates to various other ethical concerns. So this feels it feels to me like the essence of what Torah is. To start with human health, as we know, Jewish values and law are obsessed with pikuach nefesh, saving life. And the data is clear out there in terms of what humans ought to be consuming and not be consuming. Secondly, on the climate change crisis, the environmental responsibilities we have, the urgency to be guardians of the earth, as we learn from Genesis and well beyond from many of the laws and values as it regards to securing a future for our children and grandchildren and for many generations to come. But as importantly, for me personally, most importantly, is the issue of suffering and the issue of cruelty. We say in the high holiday liturgy, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur every year, we call God Kel Rachum V'Chamnun, that this is a God of mercy and compassion who wants to reduce suffering in the world. People have a misunderstanding that because there's a kosher industry, because there's kosher meat, that Judaism ultimately supports that. But I think that's an incorrect read. Ultimately, this is a religion of evolution, of constantly evolving to new eras of progress with a system built into it, and where veganism is the ideal. I got 10 seconds left, but I'm going to pass those on to our other speakers.
Thank you so much. Dr. Christina, we'd like to hear from you next.
Yes, I'm doing the same as well. I have a two-minute thing here. Okay, well, I'm also Christian, and I have a different take to Bishop Arnold. I would say that in Orthodoxy, we look back to much of what the fathers have taught. And for them, it's clear that the original diet given by God is in Genesis 1:29, that Christ did not come to change the law, but to fulfill it, and that whilst we are Christians, we nonetheless have the Old Testament and the Jewish faith in our holy book. And that must be taken into consideration, I think, seriously. And I've written a great deal on diet and Noah, and I have no time to do that. But what I would say is that the fathers are very clear that the allowing of meat in our diet is a dispensation on the ideal. And I can quote, "For those with hardened hearts who cannot keep to the original diet, because we are with sin, and it's hard for us to keep to all of God's commandments. Over the periods, we have been given more and more dispensations. A classic one would be divorce, for example, with Moses. That was given for other reasons. But so I think, so it's a dispensation on the ideal, and it's still there. So I think we can certainly justify, if we need to, the eating of a vegan diet. It is a diet, as the fathers also say, that produces harmony, peace. You cannot have harmony and peace in the world if you're going to kill other creatures. Our role as image of God is just that. And then the question is, who is your God? I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Christina. Dr. Will.
Yes, thank you. So in the Buddhist tradition, it's well understood that there are, we don't call them commandments, but it's precepts, not to kill, not to harm, not to steal, not to abuse, sexually abuse others. And in the Buddhist tradition, it's not confined to humans. It's very specific that it's all sentient beings. So in the Buddhist tradition, when the Buddha brought this tradition, when he had his enlightenment experience, 500 BC in India, it was really a reform movement in India, and it moved the entire subcontinent of India away from meat eating and away from animal sacrifices toward vegetarianism. And when it spread to Eastern Asia, like to China and to the Eastern Asia where they didn't do dairy, it was just basically introduced veganism into the world for the first time. When I was a Zen Buddhist monk in Korea, I was in a monastery that had been practicing vegan living for 850 years. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, no wool, no silk, no leather, no killing of insects. The whole thing is based on ahimsa. Ahimsa is the Sanskrit word that means non-violence. And the whole idea is that if we're really serious about spiritual awakening, we're not going to be needlessly abusing other living beings in any way. And that's really the foundation of spiritual maturity, of morality, and of a society where peace and justice and freedom are actually possible. So it's really hardwired into the Buddhist teaching, nonviolence, and what we would call today veganism. There's an old word in Japanese, shojin, which means refraining from eating animal foods for ethical reasons, right? It's basically, this is an ancient teaching. It goes way back before we coined the word vegan. In the Buddhist tradition, it goes way back. So it's foundational, really, to the Buddhist practice. It doesn't mean everybody does it. Buddhism has been strongly influenced by the West and has been pushed away from these teachings, but foundationally, it is kind of baked into Buddhism.
Thank you for sharing. I went to an all vegan restaurant in LA called Shojin, and so that makes perfect sense now that you explained that. Thank you. Okay, so our next question that we're going to be discussing is, what does compassion for animals look like in your religion? What are humanity's responsibilities to animals, if any, in your faith? And we will start with Dr. Christina for this question.
Okay, so it's a two-part question, so we'll have a two-part answer. And here, Bishop and I know will definitely agree with this one, because compassion for animals, in the epitome of this would be the saints. Many of the early saints, well, not just the early saints, even up until today, we can see through the lives of the saints had wonderful relationships with animals, compassionate ones. And you won't be able to see it in great detail, but here on this side we have St. Isaac the Syrian. It gives wonderful teaching in his mystic treatise on compassion for all things, including the animals. And it's a compassionate heart that cannot bear to see the slightest injury to any creature. And we had the saints from St. Anthony right the way through, and of course St. Francis, and the present Pope, who I think is very much like the original St. Francis, is a wonderful, wonderful man. So I think we could say that they epitomize compassion. Humanity's responsibilities to animals. Well, let's come back to the image of God. This is not said of any other creature. I think we can argue that there's an image of God in all things, the spark of God, which I know in Eastern Orthodox we understand different to that, perhaps, of the Catholics. But nonetheless, who is your God? And if your God is an all-loving and compassionate God, and we are to be his image, you cannot be an all-loving and compassionate God if you're going to kill, abuse, exploit, and mistreat anything. And that, as theologians, we talk in terms of good and evil. I know that's a very old-fashioned concept, but nonetheless, it fits nicely in arguments like this. You know, we have to be kind and compassionate to all things because we are the image of God. There we are.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Shimi, if you'd like to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to remind us of the scale of what we're talking about over 80 billion land animals a year. Right? We're talking about broiler chickens that kept in large, dark sheds, often 30,000 or more stuffed into this shed. We're talking about a bird killing line that's 90 to 120 birds a minute on the line, 7,200 an hour. When talking about eggs, we're talking, they kill the hens once they just can't produce these eggs anymore. The battery cages just darked and crammed. Veal calves killed at 4 months since they can't be milked after their maternal deprivation. Forced pregnancies every year so they can always produce milk. So with this, I would identify 5 philosophical camps within the Jewish framework. One would be utilitarianism or consequentialism, addressing the greatest suffering. This is the greatest quantitatively and qualitatively amount of suffering on the planet, what we're talking about, utilitarianism. From deontology, the notion that we have a duty to all others. We have a responsibility and codified laws around those duties and responsibilities. Thirdly is virtue ethics. What kind of people do we want to be? And as Dr. just said, want to be like that God, emulating the divine, and compassionate. So from the perspective of utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics, the 3 main camps, we see that. Then phenomenology, look at Buber or Levinas, the notion of encountering the face of another and how that awakens us to a deeper spiritual consciousness. And lastly, thanks to Martha Nussbaum at University of Chicago, the neo-Aristotelian capability approach, that it is wrong to block another from actualizing their capability. When one has had no life experience, they're just crammed into a cage or a box their entire existence. We're dealing here with a notion that God wants freedom. God wants potential to be fulfilled. And here in the factory farming industry, no one is fulfilling any of their potential.
Thank you so much. Dr. Will, if you'd like to share.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. Thank you, Rabbi, for reminding us of the scale that we're talking about. I think that's really important. And if we include marine animals, we're talking about literally billions of animals every single day that we human beings are killing. So this is really the core of our society. It's massive. And so getting back to the Buddhist tradition, the essential thing really in the Buddhist tradition, there's different ways of looking at it, but one of the ideas in the Buddhist tradition is getting away from the idea of good and evil and more toward the idea of skillful and unskillful actions. And the basic idea is that unskillful actions lead to suffering for oneself and others, that all life is completely interconnected. And whatever we sow, we're going to reap. This is a foundational teaching in the Buddhist tradition. So there's also reincarnation, or the idea of rebirth, that whatever seeds we sow, we're going to experience in future lifetimes. So if we're going to insist on being an agent of violence and abuse toward other sentient beings, then we will experience that ourselves. So there's this sense of it's unskillful because it causes more suffering to myself, it reduces my spiritual capacity, and it causes suffering to others, and there's one life living through all of us. So that basic idea goes contrary. And skillful actions essentially are in alignment with what's called dharmata. Dharmata is the way the universe is. The way the universe is it's one life living through all of us. There's no fundamentally separate self in Buddhism. We are all expressions of a life. So this body is not what we are. That's the delusion. So when we see others merely as a physical object, like when we see a cow just as something to be used, that's a delusion. That's unskillful and it causes suffering. So the whole idea is in Buddhism to come back to our wisdom, our true nature, which is wise and awake. It's fundamentally a very positive, optimistic view. And then to live that way skillfully with compassion for all.
Oh, I think Dr. Will, you just froze there at the end. So while we wait for you to hopefully come back, we can move on.
Meditate effectively. Our mind is always busy. We end up in. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Bishop John, would you like to go next?
Yes, certainly. I think that we are waking up, certainly in the Christian faith, to the dignity of the creatures that God has created, that they all have their dignity and they should not be exploited. And that, I think, is something that we're learning across the board, that we have become dreadful exploiters of the resources that we have, whether it's animals or the world in which we live. And we're learning a lot. There are lots of organizations. I've just become president of Catholic Concern for Animals. I don't know too much about his work at the moment, but I'm very impressed by what I see in terms of its education about the dignity of animals. And I'm fully aware of the cruelty that we show to animals in order to provide us with the meat that we want is horrendous. Battery farming and and the rest of it. It's really quite awful the way, but we're becoming more sensitive, I think, to what animals feel, their intelligence, what they understand, how they communicate with one another, how they protect one another. And I think it's very important that we should be understanding animals for what they are and for the dignity that they have. At the same time, though, if we look at nature, animals consume animals. It's part of simply the cycle of nature. And I think that we're part of that too. And I can't see realistically that we could come to that point where we would say we're never going to consume animals again. I mean, a growing number of people, I think, believe that to be the right practice, and I admire them for that. And I certainly move in that direction myself, but I don't think I would come to the completion of that for myself. But certainly, I would say that the compassion for animals is something that we are growing in our understanding of that in the Catholic Church. I think we should be very grateful to Pope Francis, and thank you to Dr. Christina for outlining so many saints who have honored animals and seen animals for what they are as God's gift to us as part of our stewarding of creation and not our exploiting of creation. And what are humanity's responsibilities to animals? I think that they're treated with that dignity that is innate in them. They are created by God and they have a dignity, and they are part, and that dignity should be preserved and understood and protected.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we are going to move on to our third question, which is that people must consume food in order to survive. Does your religion offer any guidance on how humans should nourish themselves? Does that guidance point towards any greater ideas such as harmony, interdependence, purity, or compassion? Is there a name for this system? We are going to start with Rabbi Shimi for this one.
Okay, awesome. Well, Jewishly, eating is to be celebrated. Jews love to eat. Everything is built around eating. And there's no guilt or shame in that we are not just souls that happen to have a body, nor are we just bodies that happen to have a soul. Those are deeply interconnected, and nourishing the body is an important part of nourishing the soul when done righteously. And the main institution is brachot, blessings, that every type of food has its own blessing to be recited. And when holding that food, one elevates their spiritual consciousness towards how was the worker treated producing this food? How was the animal treated? How was the earth treated? How is my body treated when I consume this? The blessing is an awakening of consciousness. That's the first. The second is kashrut, keeping kosher. There's 4 eras. The first is the Garden of Eden, a vegan diet according to the rabbis. The second is the korban, the animal sacrifice. This continues to evolve to the kosher slaughter diet. And then built into that is the next evolution, moving towards life affirmation, that God has removed God's omnipotence from the world in order to actualize human responsibility. Humans become more responsible as God's presence becomes more hidden in the world. And with that increased responsibility, we are to emulate the Melech Chafetz B'Chaim in Hebrew, the king who loves life. And that's the era we're in now, in the era of reciting blessings, experiencing a divine presence, and experiencing that through the hiddenness, through our own responsibility to be morally uplifting of all life.
Thank you so much. Dr. Will.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Well, in the Buddhist tradition, there's as I already said, there's a strong emphasis on not eating animal foods, not eating animals in general, not harming animals. And I mentioned earlier shojin. The words in Chinese or other languages for vegetarianism or for veganism, they actually include, there's the idea of strict vegetarianism or veganism, which doesn't include what are called black foods, which are basically onion and garlic and so forth. They're considered to be too stimulating for meditation. But the general idea is to refrain from eating animal foods in the Buddhist tradition. When we go to places like Taiwan or China or Korea and so forth and give lectures, and people say, that they're vegan or vegetarian, it's pretty much always because they're Buddhist. You know, people understand that Buddhism pushes people in that direction, helps people to go in that direction, gives a foundation for that. And it's interesting because when you go back, you see now actually today, so-called vegan foods like vegan pork and chicken and tuna, all these things. This goes back centuries to the temples in China where the monks would create these big feasts for the donors who were supporting them. The donors very often were not as strict as the monks. They were trying to be vegetarian or what we would call today vegan. And so the monks would create these foods to please them that tasted like chicken and pork and so forth, but were not. They were totally soy-based or plant-based or rice-based, something like that. So there's been a strong push for centuries to be creative in the Buddhist tradition, to create foods that are delicious, but also that will please the people who are not yet evolved enough in their spiritual practice to actually embrace an ethical way of eating. So I think all of these things are important to understand in our practice, that spirituality and veganism have been linked for thousands of years. And the Buddhist tradition shows that.
Thank you for sharing. Bishop John.
Yes, people must consume food in order to survive, certainly, but in our affluence, certainly in many parts of the developed world, we've got to the point of abusing food in ridiculous statistics we now have about people's obesity and the junk food that we consume. I think that's a real problem, and it's an abuse, I think, to the society and to creation in general, as to that loss of discipline for ourselves. What does my religion offer any guidance? I wouldn't say that we label anything about how we should nourish ourselves. We should, as part of our self-respect, be looking after ourselves, and that's something that I think we've rather lost the proper focus on, or at least many people have. And really, when you put it in the wider context of creation, we've got the ridiculous statistics that, you know, a cow will consume 100 calories of grain or whatever, and actually produce 6 calories as meat to be eaten. It shows a complete misuse of our resources, and that plays into deforestation, doesn't it? That we are creating a real problem for ourselves by destroying our forests in order to provide food for meat to be used so ineffectively. But that's not to lose sight of the respect that we need to have for the animals that we have. I'm quite drawn to learning from the indigenous peoples who managed to live in harmony with the world in ways that we seem to have lost. And they seem to have a great respect for animals. Some they consume, yes, but they have that respect that allows for the flourishing of the animal in its natural life cycle. And I think we've got something to learn from there, with the atrocious way in which we treat animals now to provide the mass amounts of food, meat that we want to consume.
Thank you for sharing. And Dr. Christina.
Sorry, I was just looking up something there. Someone said about the graves of lust, and I was just checking it was numbers. People must consume food in order to survive. Okay, so in the Orthodox faith, we are vegan for over half of the year. We have a very strict program of what you can and cannot eat. We have a fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. We have 50 days at Christmas, 40 days at Christmas, 50 days at Pascha. There is the Feast of the Theotokos, which is another 2 weeks, and then there's another one, and so on and so on throughout the year. So we can say, if we were to look at that if we were to follow that, we as Orthodox Christians are vegan for half of the year. However, it has nothing to do with animal protection. It is more to do with asceticism, coming out of monasticism from the very early church. But I think going back, we can say that many of the early fathers and mothers, especially desert fathers and mothers, they were vegetarian. They did not eat meat. And so we have a very strong tradition, but unfortunately it's not sort of animal protection based, unlike perhaps that of the Buddhists. That said, I do think that many of the early saints were also very compassionate, and I would like to think that there was some overlap there, but of course, like everything else, many of the teachings that we have for the fathers were written against heresies of one form or another, so they weren't necessarily giving their life stories. Others generally wrote their life stories for them. So I suspect there probably were some care for and concern for animals. But we do have in the Orthodox faith, we do have very, very deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all created beings. And so I think that's something else that can be explored, but it doesn't have a particular name or thing. It's just the fast. And unfortunately, even on days where meat is not allowed, some animals are. For example, octopus and squid and the like, because these are deemed to be animals without blood. And so we can go back to ignorance there, their lack of knowledge of the fact that they have a blood. It's just different color to ours and so forth. And that's the root of why some animals are, but most of the land animals are not, or all of the land animals are not. Sorry.
Thank you for sharing. That brings us to our last planned question. We will take time for some audience questions at the end, but this last one is, what have you seen be most effective in moving people toward veganism within your community? We'll start with Dr. Will.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the thing I think that's most effective in the Buddhist tradition of helping people move toward actually living the Buddhist teachings of compassion for animals has been to somehow reignite their confidence in their tradition. You know, the West has hit the rest of the world very hard, and the West basically is extremely carnivorous. And so we have this profusion of McDonald's and Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken, you know, all over the world. When we go to Africa and lecture there, we see people not eating what they ate indigenously, which was mostly plant-based. Now they want to eat animal-based foods. And so now elephants and lions and zebras are all getting wiped out and destroyed because we need to grow soybeans and corn the way we do in the United States and the Midwest and Africa, so we can feed all our factory farm cows and pigs and chickens, which are now in Africa too. And this is all over the world, in Asia, everywhere. And so when I go, for example, Madeline and I go to China or to Asia, and we're, you know, white people basically bringing the vegan message. They love it. They love it because it's like, yes, you know, I'm always emphasizing the importance of honoring your indigenous tradition, you know, honoring the wisdom of Buddhism, and not allowing ourselves to feel that, well, the West, you know, they have all the technological progress. We've got to eat like they do. And the first thing people want to do when they make more money is eat more meat, watch more Western movies and TV shows that are always promoting animal foods, and become like that. And then they get the diseases. They get diabetes and heart disease and cancer and obesity. and all these diseases that come from eating these foods, which is of course part of the plan. We want to sell more drugs. We want to basically enslave the population. The way you enslave people is have them eat animal foods. So the whole idea is if we want to have freedom for ourselves, we need to free animals. And I think this underlying idea is really at the core of Buddhism. Buddhism is really about liberation, and liberation, and not just physically, but on every level, spiritually as well. And that means liberating animals. And so it's basically education and understanding that we should honor the ancient spiritual teachings and not honor the what's happening with modern technology.
For sharing. Bishop John.
Thank you. I agree with a great deal of what Dr. Will has said, particularly about this obsession with westernizing countries as they grow economically and wanting to adopt the worst aspects of Western culture, of fashion, and all the rest of it becomes obsessive, doesn't it? But for me, I think what is important and effective for me is the example of Pope Francis, particularly when he says everything is connected. And I think he's drawn our attention to the way our world works, that everything is connected. And as we grow in increasing concern for climate change and the damage we're doing to the environment, our role concerning eating and the producing of food is of great importance. It would be absolutely fine if we were to eat much more plant-based food. We would be doing our world a great service. We'd be avoiding deforestation. We'd be providing enough food for everybody, and that we squander the wealth that we have in agriculture by this obsession with producing meat. And I think Pope Francis has been really effective with Laudato Si and then with Laudato Deum in asking people to educate themselves in care for our common home. And that has a great deal to do with the impact of our consumption of meat, particularly red meat, and that there is, I think, a growing interest in our local communities, our parishes, for people to be learning what they can do in what they think may seem to be insignificant ways, but in fact, when we're doing even small acts, it adds up. And Pope Francis had that wonderful image recently where he said, all the great reservoirs and dams and rivers of the world are made up of single drops of water. And the drops of water are absolutely essential. Well, let's be drops of water, but let's add our efforts with one another and become more educated in the way that we care for our common home and have that respect for the sentient nature of the creatures that surround us, who are all God's creatures, and we need to respect them and to have that proper sense of balance in the way that we live our lives.
Thank you. Dr. Christina.
Right, well, I have to report that it's not good news. Nothing is being done to change the views on diet in Orthodoxy. I'm thinking back to early last year, my husband and I attended a very large conference, Orthodox conference. It was not one thing that we could eat that very first day. It's just not really on the consciousness of Orthodoxy. We have this fasting, and then you stick to the fasting, and that's it. So in that regard, I don't think we're doing a very good job. Education, I'm just having to revise a chapter for a handbook basically on this, and looking at seminaries, and it would be great if we could have creation care. I've written a course actually based on early texts. It's on our website, Pan Orthodox Concern for Animals. Happy for everyone to use it. if we could do something like that in our seminaries, and I don't know what the Catholics are doing. I believe it's not really in the seminaries either. I think it's still very traditional teachings in both lots. But I would say that I'm being asked to go. Last year I was at the Middle East Council of Churches as the Orthodox voice. And there I spoke on the link between the meat diet and climate instability. I do a lot of teaching and lecturing on that now. So I think, as the bishop said, I emphasize the inefficiency of it and monetize it by saying, if you give me $100 and I give you back 17, or if you give me $100 and I give you back 43, you wouldn't run your house on this. You just wouldn't run your finances. And yet this is what we do when we give grain or protein to the animals and then eat the animals. It is just so very inefficient, as well as devastating in many other ways. So it's a mixed bag, I'm afraid.
Thank you for sharing. And we had someone in the chat asking for your website, but it looks like Barbara shared, so that is good. Thank you. Rabbi Shimi.
Thank you. Yeah, I just first want to share how inspired I am by the other panelists and their commitment, their values, and what they're doing in their communities. Reflecting on the Jewish community and what's working, I think a lot is working right now, actually. I'll say something about America and something about Israel, although there's Jews all over the world, of course. In the US, I would say what's working less is just education. Classes, documentaries, books. I mean, that works with a limited number that are kind of already in those circles. What's working more for us is working for institutional change to reach people who would not access. So we have a synagogue vegan challenge program where we give grants to synagogues to offer vegan meals every month and offer some education there. And now people experience this type of meal they've never had before, and it kind of brings into their consciousness this reality. The second is a debates program. Debate sounds kind of intense, but we've given an offer for a $5,000 award to any rabbi that can beat me in a debate as to whether Judaism is pro-vegan or not. And so I'm now debating rabbis around the country, and their audiences show up, and their audience gets to vote. So we're trying to try some new creative things like this to get into institutions. Now, Israel is really interesting on this front because my colleague shared there that today there's about 500,000 vegans in Israel. Of the about 7 million Jews living there, 500,000, that's about 7%. 12 years ago, it was only 100,000, as opposed to 500,000 now. So over the last 12 years in Israel, we're talking about going from 100,000 Jews in Israel who are vegan to 500,000. That's a massive leap. And those three populations of Jews there make up three types. There's the indigenous, who have lived in Israel for millennia. Then there's the Ashkenazim, who are kind of very Holocaust focused. That's only about 30%. Only about 30% of Israeli Jews are white. And connected to Europe, and that Holocaust consciousness informs it. And the third, this other group is the Sephardic Jews, who are exiled from Arab countries in mass. Really Middle Eastern Jews or Arab Jews, and who are very influenced by the surrounding culture as well. Now, the bad news is, outside of that 7%, the rest is eating animal products in mass. And so there's still a lot of work to do in that regard. And in American Jewish life, we're still looking at significant commitment to traditional Jewish diets. So there's a lot of work to do, but that's kind of my last word on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have about 11 minutes left, and we can take some questions. I see Dr. Chapman Chen raising his hand. You can go ahead and ask.
So may I speak now?
Yes.
Yes, I'm Chapman Chen. I'm writing a book entitled Vegan Theology. Well, with respect, I disagree with Bishop Arnold saying that Jesus ate meat or fish. because Jesus explicitly said that I desire compassion, not sacrifice. And in fact, Jesus was a pioneering martyr for animal liberation in emptying the holy temple of animals about to be slaughtered for sacrifice, and in calling the temple turned butcher's shop, a den of thieves or a den of robbers. Jesus actually debunked the business fraud of animal sacrifice and disrupted the chief priests and scribes' lucrative revenue stream, who immediately afterwards conspired to have Jesus killed, and eventually leading to his crucifixion, etc. As for Jesus eating fish or eating lamb, Jesus did
darling.
Jesus did not eat lamb at Passover, for he deliberately held the Last Supper before Passover, John 13, verse 1. And also, as for fish, the Greek word for fish, ichthus, was a code word for Jesus Christ, Son of God and Savior.
We want to try to keep this short and sweet. So if you can, we can let John Arnold respond, or we can move on. Thank you. Sorry to have to.
All right. Yeah.
Well, I would disagree. If Jesus had been promoting veganism, I think he would have said something very specifically in the scriptures about that. I see that he stopped the sacrifice of animals in the temple because that was because he objected to the temple being made into a place of business and profiteering, which he objected to. So I don't see any reason to believe that Jesus did not eat meat. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Dr. Will, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I just want to encourage people, when you have a chance, maybe there's a new documentary film coming out called Christspiracy, and it kind of dives deeply into this question of Jesus and the temple and other religions too, Jainism, Buddhism, Judaism. It just goes into the whole thing more in depth, and I think it's not as black and white. I think there's a lot of truth personally to what Chapman Chen is saying, that very often scriptures, of course, get modified according to what people want to hear and what people want to say and have power and so forth. So I think it's good to keep an open mind and check out Christspiracy. It's coming soon, and it has a lot more information on this. I think it's a good idea.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. We will take another.
Sorry,
Dr. Christina wanted to respond first.
No, as I say, I've written and researched in depth on this, and certainly Dr. Chen is right when it comes to the issue of sacrifice. Animals are there as a substitute. It's very complicated. Human sacrifice was quite common around the world actually, but nonetheless. So I think perhaps I might put my chapter on Noah up on the website so that people can look at that in perhaps greater depth. There might help.
Thank you so much. We have time for another short question if anyone wants to type one or raise their hand. Anyone else? I'm just checking the chat to make sure I don't miss anything. I'll check the live as well. If any of our panel, I see Nyana, is that your name?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your question?
Hi. I mean, you had this last question about how everyone is trying to change that and pass on the message. And I just wanted to understand, like, what is the hurdle they have seen so far, all the panelists, like when they try to tell someone, what is the most common response they get? Like, just to kind of be more aware. So when anyone is interested, they can try to be more prepared if they're trying to pass on the message. So when it's based on faith, like when you're talking to people, what is it that comes back? Is it more like a practical thing that, oh, I just don't know what to eat because the cultural food is all this, and or is it more like a philosophical thing or a practical, pragmatic thing? Like what is the most common hurdle that comes up?
I'm happy to start on that, and then I'd love to hear others as well, and I'll be brief. But that's a great question. Thank you. For me, I think it's really not about truth. I think very little of our fight is, I think this is true and we disagree. It's much more psychological. Behavioral change is hard. People are embedded in relationships that have a certain style of eating. They don't know any other way. It's very scary to think about having to make some leap. So I think rather than just kind of fighting truth, fighting with truth, I think it's much more, how do we welcome people into communities and form healthy relationships where people can find that behavioral change to be easier? That's my 2 cents. I'd love to hear from someone else on that great question.
Yeah, I'll just thank you so much, Rabbi. I totally agree. It's not so much scriptural references and so forth can sometimes be helpful, but for the most part, people want to fit in and be liked and well liked by the people around them. And so I remember when we were in India, very often a whole family would come up to us and say, "We're all vegan." And the idea was, it's such a traditional society. People are very tightly woven, and one person cannot say, "Well, I'm vegan." Everybody else, everybody eats the same food. And so in those cases, it was great. Then the whole family went vegan, then it worked. But even in the West, where we're more individuals, we still like to fit in. And so when we have a church fish fry or a church barbecue or whatever it is, it kind of gives this message. This is how we eat. And so I think I still think it's education, to helping people to understand that we're healthier this way. Of course, it's more compassion. It goes more in alignment with the teachings of the founders of our religions, and then giving examples of that. And the final thing I'll just say is, when you reach a certain critical mass within, say, a congregation, it gets much easier. Like we had people doing World Peace Diet facilitator book study groups in churches. And when you got maybe 10 or 15% of the congregation to kind of learn about it, then when they had the potlucks, it was easy to get the whole congregation to say, yeah, let's make it a vegan potluck. Because like when you have crippled people who have disabilities, for example, you don't just say, well, too bad for you, you can't come. You have to just go up the stairs. If you can't come up the stairs, you're not welcome. So now it's the same thing with people in the congregation who are now vegan. You don't just say, well, everybody bring meat, dairy, eggs, bring whatever you want. The vegans just don't matter. They can just eat their own thing. You create this consciousness that we care for each other, and as vegans, it's a choice that we make. And so it just helps the entire congregation to move in that direction as a matter of respect for each other and trying out new things. And when we try out new things, then we learn that it's better for the environment, it's better for our health. It goes along with the teachings even better. Then real progress is made. So we have to have a proactive approach, I think, that uses both education and also practical, teaching people like how to make spaghetti without meatballs or whatever. All these kinds of things have to go together.
Do any of our other panelists want to respond? Dr. Christina? Yes.
Yes, I think one thing important to say is the eating of meat is not a sin in the Christian faith. We have to accept this because it has been provided for by God in the Old Testament, as I say, as a dispensation, but nonetheless, it's there. So, the framing of the argument, if you're going to have an argument on that basis, it needs to be a recognition that those that do eat meat are not culpable of any sin. I have been a vegan for 55 years, and I honestly think that people don't really care very much about animals. I've done frontline animal work and what I do now for decades and decades. It's either in you, I think. You either get it or you don't. I'm not sure you ever win an argument. You can point them in the direction, you can show them the teachings, but I wonder if it's a personal journey that we're all on. I mean, I had a fur coat. I had a rabbit skin coat when I became a vegetarian. I had just started, and I didn't know about that side of it. So it could be that it's God's way of bringing us along. But I'm not sure having arguments and quoting Bible and other stuff is, in the Christian faith at least, is really worth the effort. I think we can make people aware of it, but perhaps we should not leave it to God, but I think it's probably the workings of God within us that will help us to see that we can live perfectly well without killing any other creature. And what is not to like on that? What is not to like? Why not do that?
Thank you so much.
I think the youngsters, because of the educational climate, I think there's a very big growth in veganism because they now understand better than the older people the link between the meat and dairy diet, and climate change. And of course, it's the young that's going to cop most of that. So I think there are these two things going on. Certainly, education is needed, but I wouldn't try very hard to change people's diet. They'll either get it or they won't. That's a personal.
Thank you for your response. We are 1 minute past time, so I am going to wrap us up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Please save the date for our next panel, which will be happening September 23rd, and you can go to our Facebook website, sign up for our e-blast, all these different things. You'll be getting an email after this in an hour or so with a link to the recording and our other links and everything else you might possibly need. Thank you again so much to our panelists and Barbara for helping coordinate this. And let's just continue to spread love and compassion and help the animals and the planet. Thank you.